There is a body in the ground that does not belong to the century it was buried in, not because of how it was laid to rest, because of what is written inside it. Nearly half of this person's ancestry traces to a population more than 1,000 miles away across open water from a part of the world that, according to every accepted timeline historians have relied on for decades, would not reach this place for another 1,000 years. This is not a story about a temple, not about a king, a dynasty, or an empire's rise and fall. It is a story about one skeleton in an ordinary grave, whose blood arrived on a schedule no textbook predicted and no record explains. For generations, the people of this land have been described as one of the oldest continuous populations in mainland Southeast Asia, a population whose maternal lineages, the DNA passed quietly from mother to child across thousands of years, have been traced back an estimated 55 to 68,000 years. Think of that lineage like a surname passed down not on paper, but inside the body itself, copied and recopied through generation after generation without ever needing to be written down or spoken aloud. A 2013 study out of the Kunming Institute of Zoology, drawing blood samples from more than 1,000 Cambodians across 14 distinct communities, including several Aboriginal groups rarely studied before, found exactly this kind of deep, ancient, homegrown genetic root system, old, layered, and largely undisturbed by outside contact for most of human history. And then there is the history everyone learns alongside that genetic story. Hindu temples rising out of jungle clearings, Sanskrit inscriptions carved into sandstone lintels, Buddhist iconography repeated across 9 centuries of construction. The accepted narrative says Indian culture arrived by sea, through trade routes stretching across the Bay of Bengal, and was simply adopted by the people already living there, the way a country today might adopt a foreign legal code or a foreign script without absorbing the population that originally built it. The empire that eventually rose from this exchange, the Khmer Empire, spanned from 802 to 1431 CE, and at its height controlled much of mainland Southeast Asia, building temple cities meant to last longer than any single dynasty ever could. Its civilization is taught respectfully and consistently as homegrown, borrowed ideas, native blood, borrowed religion, native blood, borrowed script, native blood. That has been the formula in textbooks and museum placards for a very long time, and on its surface it is a reasonable one. A population with 60,000 years of continuous local ancestry simply choosing, on its own terms, to wrap itself in someone else's gods and someone else's alphabet. But if the exchange really was only cultural, only ideas, only religion, only language passing hands across the water, why would any researcher bother going looking for actual biological mixture at all? And why, when a team finally did look closely, did they find something far stranger than a little bit of Indian blood somewhere in the family tree? Here is where it gets complicated. In a cemetery called Vat Komnou at a site named Angkor Borei, centuries before the word Angkor would ever apply to a temple, archaeologists excavated the remains of a child who lived sometime between the years 78 and 234 CE, a window established through direct radiocarbon dating of the bone itself, not estimated, not inferred from descendants, but read directly off the skeleton. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should. Most ancestry timelines for ancient migrations are built backward, like reading a river's history by studying only the water at its mouth and guessing what happened upstream. This time, researchers had something rarer, water sampled directly from the source. When a research team that included scientists connected to Harvard's ancient DNA laboratories sequenced that child's genome, they found something that should not have been possible under the existing model. Somewhere between 40 and 50% of this child's ancestry was South Asian, not symbolic, not a faint trace buried deep in the math, close to half. To understand exactly what that number breaks, consider the comparison point. Present-day Cambodians carry, on average, somewhere around 7 to 9% South Asian ancestry. A small, well-documented minority signal, the kind a geneticist would call modest and unremarkable on its own. The earlier estimates for when that mixing happened were drawn entirely from people alive today, using genetic dating methods that work backward from living populations toward an inferred point of contact. Those methods place the mixing event in the 12th or 13th century CE, the heart of the Angkor period. The Empire era, the homegrown civilization that simply borrowed ideas from a far era that everyone learns first. This child lived roughly 1,000 years before that. Not by decades, not by a single generation or two stacked together, by centuries. An ancient individual carrying 5 to 7 times more South Asian ancestry than anyone living in the country today, buried not beside a king, not inside a temple complex, but in an unremarkable cemetery. As if, at some specific point in the deep past, this kind of ancestry was simply ordinary, unremarkable, nothing worth marking with status or stone, So how does a population move from carrying nearly half foreign ancestry around the year 200 to under 10% today, and do it centuries before the empire that was supposedly responsible for that mixing had even been founded? That is the question driving everything that follows. It does not have a clean answer, but that has not stopped researchers from trying. The first theory is the one most historians would reach for instinctively because it fits the existing picture without breaking it too badly. It says that a small, mobile class of South Asian merchants, priests, and craftsmen settled in the earliest trading towns of this region, places very much like the settlement where this child was buried, and intermarried with local families on a modest scale, generation after generation, quietly, without leaving behind monuments to themselves. Over the generations that followed, as the wider population grew and slowly absorbed that small founding group, the unusually high ancestry fraction of those first families diluted outward, the way a single drop of dye spreads and fades across a much larger volume of still water until the color is barely detectable. This theory carries genuine weight. Indian cultural contact with mainland Southeast Asia is documented archaeologically as far back as the 4th century BCE, long before any organized kingdom existed here, and the settlement near where this child was found was one of the very first Indian-influenced city-states anywhere in the region. But dilution of that kind tends to be gradual, and it tends to be even. It produces a slow, steady decline spread fairly uniformly across a population over many centuries. Not a single child in an ordinary grave carrying nearly half foreign ancestry, while presumably almost everyone buried around that child did not. If this were simply a small founding group slowly fading into the majority, this particular burial should look more typical of its era, not more extreme than anything found since. The theory does not explain why the single most concentrated example of this mixing ever discovered isn't sitting in a palace tomb or a priestly shrine, but in the kind of grave reserved, as far as anyone can tell, for nobody in particular. This is the part the records don't explain. The second theory is more complicated and considerably more disruptive to the existing timeline. It suggests this wasn't a handful of traders quietly marrying into the edges of local society over generations. It suggests that a substantial South Asian population actually settled and intermixed intensively within specific communities tied directly to the formation of the very first organized state in the entire region, meaning the Indianization everyone learns about wasn't a slow trickle of religion and vocabulary, but something closer to genuine demographic settlement, body for body, family for family, household by household, along that same riverbank. If true, this would mean the real genetic mixing predates the well-known Angkor Empire by roughly 1,000 years, quietly rewriting when scholars believed deep, intimate contact with South Asia actually began in this part of the world. Researchers are careful to frame this as a probability worth investigating, not a settled certainty. And the theory carries its own unresolved problem, one nobody has yet managed to fully close. If a large, deeply intermixed population genuinely existed that early, migrations of that scale usually leave behind a strong, evenly distributed genetic signature, one that persists and often even compounds across the centuries that follow, rather than nearly disappearing. Something thinned this particular signal out far more aggressively than ordinary demographic blending tends to allow, and nobody has fully explained what that something was. And here, the story stops being simple. The third theory, the one most researchers are hesitant to say plainly out loud because the data doesn't confirm it, it only fails to rule it out, is that this child belonged to a population that was genetically distinct and possibly short-lived or socially separate in some way from the wider community growing up around it, perhaps a tightly knit trading enclave that married mostly among itself for a generation or two before either dispersing, dying out, or simply being absorbed so unevenly that almost no later trace of it survived in the surrounding villages, a population whose cultural and political influence on the founding of the region's first organized state may have vastly outweighed its own genetic survival into the present. Under this theory, the people who helped architect the very beginning of Khmer statehood may have been, biologically speaking, a population that has almost entirely vanished from the modern gene pool, meaning the cultural inheritance everyone recognizes today, the script, the religion, the architecture, may trace back to founders who are, genetically, nearly invisible now. Researchers note that this child's ancestry proportion is higher than that of any other ancient or present-day population studied anywhere across mainland Southeast Asia. That fact alone does not prove a vanished founding population ever existed. It also does not disprove one. The data doesn't confirm this. It only fails to rule it out. Imagine standing at the edge of this settlement sometime in the 1st century CE. long before stone temples, long before the word Angkor meant anything to anyone living here. The air is thick and wet, heavy with the smell of river silt and wood smoke drifting off cooking fires built into raised earthen mounds above the floodline. The ground underfoot is soft, recently rebuilt after the last flood season, the kind of soil that remembers every season it has ever absorbed. Boats arrive steadily from across open water, carrying goods, language, and people from a coastline most of the families in this settlement will never see with their own eyes. Down by the riverbank market, several languages overlap at once, none of them dominant yet, none of them quite foreign either. Just sound, layered over sound, the ordinary noise of a town that does not yet know its own future. Somewhere in this settlement, on an unremarkable day, a child is born carrying ancestry from two distant worlds folded quietly into one small, ordinary body. No one here marks the occasion as historic. No one writes it down. No one here knows that this child, or others like this child, will sit at the genetic root of something that does not have a name yet. A kingdom called Funan, then later Angkor, then later still an empire spanning centuries, for hundreds of years still to come. And here is where the story stops being simple in a different way. For generations, the accepted version went something like this. Indian religion, language, and statecraft arrived peacefully through trade, and the local population adopted those ideas without ever truly mixing with the people who carried them across the water. Borrowed ideas, native blood. That is the version this episode opened with, the version still printed in textbooks and read aloud on guided tours through stone courtyards. But the evidence pulled from that grave suggests something stranger and far more intimate. Genuine, intensive, surprisingly early intermarriage, occurring at the exact moment the very first organized state in the region was being born, not centuries later, under an already established empire with the resources and stability to absorb outsiders comfortably. Here is the irony sitting underneath all of it. The population fraction that may have helped seed the founding moment of this entire civilization is now nearly absent from the descendants who carry that civilization's name forward today. Clean. Expected. That is what the consensus story always sounded like right up until this grave. Not clean, not expected. The temples remained standing. The script remained legible. The religion remained practiced for centuries after. The genetic signature of the people who may have helped build all of it did not remain, not in any proportion close to what this one child carried in their bones. The empire's cultural memory has clearly outlived its own genetic memory by a wide and still unexplained margin. This also unsettles the older, comforting idea that this is simply an unbroken, ancient population, untouched by the outside world for 60,000 years. It is not quite that simple anymore. Their story includes a deep, foundational episode of mixture that the usual dating methods completely missed. Not because the mixture never happened, but because those methods only ever asked the people living today. And the people living today are not the same witnesses as the people who were actually there when it happened. One of the archaeologists who has spent years working sites like this one has put it more plainly than any genetics paper ever could. Opening a grave like this doesn't feel like uncovering an ending. It feels like being introduced, for the first time decades after the fact, to someone the historical record had quietly erased. This pattern is not unique to one country, one grave, or one river delta. Across human history, again and again, civilizations leave behind a cultural footprint that vastly outlasts the genetic footprint of the people who first sparked them into being. A script survives long after the hands that invented it have nearly disappeared from the population that still writes it. Ancestry and identity, it turns out, are not the same kind of memory. One fades like silt being carried downstream and settling somewhere unseen, slowly, invisibly, generation after generation. The other gets carved into stone and recited intact for 1,000 years. Every population's accepted ancestry story is built almost entirely from the people living today. And the living, however certain they feel, are not always reliable witnesses to their own deepest past. The dead, on the rare occasions researchers can actually reach them, sometimes tell a very different story than the one their descendants inherited. Like the river that once carried that child's ancestors toward this delta, ancestry moves, deposits its mark somewhere unseen, and moves on, leaving behind a shoreline shaped by something the water itself no longer remembers carrying. The Cambodians were never who we thought they were, not because the truth was ever deliberately hidden from them, but because until a single grave gave up its secret, the only people anyone had ever asked were the ones already living 1,000 years downstream from the moment the truth actually happened.